everybody, welcome back. Today is Thursday, the 25th of May, and I am doing the next installment in my astrology forecasting videos. My last video I did was about the T-Square between Mars, Pluto, and Jupiter, and the square between Mars and Jupiter is still very strong today, and the opposition between Mars and Pluto is just a couple degrees. So this is all, well, the last video is still very much in effect, right? And I think at certain times like this that a lot of attention may go to these transits, and so much to the fact that we may forget that there are other aspects going on, taking place. And I also have to admit that one thing that I've noticed, and that this isn't just something, this kind of goes for all astrologers who do these kinds of forecasting videos, is that there's a tendency to put an emphasis on the positive, right? Rather than, and I mean, I don't blame people, but I mean, basically, if you're trying to, I think the way the algorithms work generally is that if you're talking about positive stuff going on, then a lot of people, well, I mean, it's not, we'll get into this. It's not just about positivity, but getting into the very nature of what's going on with this particular transit, and I'll kind of get into the philosophical discussions around that later. But there's a couple things that are happening, right? Now, one of the things that's happening is that we are going to have a conjunction between Mercury and Uranus in Taurus, which I'm excited for, and I view in a positive light, because to me, Uranus stands for breakthroughs, for if you've been in a jam and you're looking to move forward and you're looking to revolutionize, have a new innovative solution. But it's one of those things where it's like every solution needs a problem. You know what I mean? Right? And so this whole thing between Mercury and Uranus is going to be happening. It perfects on the 4th of June. And today is what did I say? It was the 25th? I'm pretty sure it's the 25th of May. Anyways, not to get bogged down in all this, we've got a ways to go. So what I'm thinking about right now is that there's some other aspects going on between the Sun and Saturn and the Sun and Mars, right? Now, the Sun has just made its way into Gemini. We're in Gemini season now. So all of a sudden we've got a different vibe, we've got a different feel to when we were had the Sun in Taurus. And what you got to consider about the Sun in Gemini is that it's a mutable sign, which stands for change and all this kind of stuff. But once you get a planet in a mutable sign, it's going to make hard aspects to the other mutable signs. So the one other mutable sign that has a lot of action in it these days is Pisces, right? Pisces has Saturn hanging out at the early degrees of Pisces right now. So as Sun ingresses into Gemini, which is already done, now it's applying a square to Saturn in Pisces, right? Now, as I described in my last video, in Hellenistic astrology, there is something called upon the 10th, right? And that means that from the position of, if you had a Gemini rising chart and you use whole sign houses, it would put Pisces in the 10th house. And any square that's happening like that, it means that it's like, if you were in the position of Pisces, you'd only have to go a quarter turn to get to Gemini. But if you were Gemini, you would have to go 3/4 turns to get to Pisces. And it's kind of like, you know, in Star Wars where you got Darth Vader and I'm talking about the prequels, right? But Obi-Wan's, I have the upper ground. It's like one of those situations that Saturn in Pisces has the upper ground on the Sun in Gemini right now, right? And this is something that you're not going to hear that many other astrologers talk about, because if you really break down what this means, it could sound kind of fatalistic or defeating or depressing, because Saturn is the planet that has to do with obstacles, that has to do with, but and then the sun he's the hero. The sun is the king. The sun is the protagonist, the main character. And in a situation like, what good is astrology if we don't talk about the good and the bad? And what I don't understand, I mean, there's all this stuff about, there's a certain spiritual philosophy called non-dualism, which is about, rather than splitting things into one and two as being good and bad, this or that we look at the whole picture of what's going on. And one of the interesting things about this is I'm saying that there is, if I were to be more positive and be more optimistic, we can look at the conjunction that we're heading into between Mercury and Uranus. And what I find interesting is that this is all happening in Taurus. What planets also just joining the party in Taurus? Jupiter has joined the party in Taurus, right? And if we look at this aspect between the Sun in Gemini and Saturn in Pisces, the Sun is ruled by Mercury, right? So the business of the Sun, the business of the king, the big business of the protagonist, the hero, is ruled over by Mercury, which we can see is on its way to have that meetup with Uranus. So, like I said, every solution needs a problem, right? And so in order to have a solution, a radical breakthrough, a eureka moment, a new development, an unexpected change of circumstances, a new twist of fate. But in order to have that, we need to have a problem. We need to have a conflict and Jupiter, when we look at Saturn, who's as Liz Greene called the old devil, right? The old devil, is kind of an antagonistic planet. But if you if you get to know Saturn, maybe there could be some benefits to having a friendlier point of view of working with Saturn. You don't need to make it into that much of a bad guy. In this situation, if you're identified with the king, you're identified with the hero, the Saturn is essentially kind of antagonistic. It's essentially kind of oppositional. And in this position, Saturn has the upper ground, right? And Saturn, I was reading the Hesiod, Hesiod's Theogony, right? And they call it the crooked counsel of Kronos, right? That there's something that if you listen to what Kronos has to say, it sounds crooked. It's not straight. It's not this sort of like the walk in the straight and narrow of the noble heroic path or whatever, right? The Kronos is it's like, as I say, the be friends with God, you have to be friends with the devil first, right? There's kind of to be friends with Saturn, right? And something I have been noticing around this transit is that there's a lot of aversion to getting stuck in past patterns, right? Now, you could talk about this in terms of karmic patterns, but I've never worked directly with yogis or people who talk about karma in that detail, so I'm not really qualified. Don't take me to be an expert on karma, but I will sort of, tell you what I kind of think about Saturn, Kronos, what it means in this, right? I mean, in some sense, we can forget about the idea of karma, and we can just talk about the past, because what does Saturn stands for time, Kronos, chronology, and there's this whole thing where you make your bed, you have to sleep in it. That there's sometimes the devil is really just the consequences of our own actions. We reap what we sow and all this, right? And if we've made mistakes in the past, we've built a certain situation for ourselves, it can be, we can feel like we're tangled in it like a knot, right? And one of the things that I thought was really interesting about this is that if we get into the nitty-gritty of the decans, that the sun is in the first decan of Gemini. And if to use the Golden Dawn system, or I don't know, what is that, there is a system though of associating tarot cards with the 36 pip tarot cards with the decans of the zodiac, and it works out that the first decan of Gemini is the Eight of Swords. In the Thoth tarot, it's called Interference. In the Rider-Waite-Smith tarot, there is an image of a woman with a blindfold on, surrounded by a bunch of swords, and it's kind of like feeling like you're in a mental prison of your own making, right? And that people, what I see a lot from the spiritual community, if you want to call it that, is a strong desire to free ourselves of this mental trap, this sort of artificial jail that we've built for ourselves by our own patterns, our own conditions. And that, I think, I was reading this book, I don't have it on my shelf right now, I took it downstairs, but Susan, was it Chang, right? Is it T.S. Chang, Susan Chang? The 36 Secrets. In that book, she was talking about how, for one thing, I've mentioned the Weird Sisters before, I've mentioned the Fates before. In the classical Greek view of the three Fates, they had the idea of the weaver, they had the idea of the allotter, and they had the idea of the one who cuts the thread, right? Now, the weaver, if you think about weaving, it's like your fate is woven. It's like a yarn, a tale of different threads woven together. And that if we think about all the things that have happened in the past and the circumstances we find ourselves in, there's a lot of stuff about not getting bogged down in the past and staying with the present moment. But often what happens is you're in the present moment, and then when you start to interact with your life, the first things you start to interact with are structures which have built up over time that are, or different forms of conditioning that are in their own way kind of structures. And there's also this kind of image that comes from Kabbalah that's like the tree, right? And the tree, you could call it the tree of life or whatever, but there's also important to consider there's a dark side to the tree too, and that there's this whole thing about whether the tree is even a good thing or not. The getting too stuck in the tree may not even be very helpful, right? And that it may be just getting bogged down in some sort of past kind of systems, some kind of past formulation about how different people said you ought to live your life, and that. But based on this, where does the tarot come from? The tarot has been described by some people as a tool for teaching Kabbalah or something like that. But some people have the point of view that rather than the tarot being consciously something where people were consciously trying to teach this thing, that the tree actually has a kind of a subconscious influence where even if you didn't know anything about Kabbalah and you didn't know anything about angels and you didn't know anything about Sephiroths or whatever, that you may have dreams where these images just emerge on their own of the unconscious, or that sometimes life itself can be like a dream, and then the things that happen in our lives are playing out these patterns, right? And there can be people wind up into this thing where they could take a Gnostic point of view and call them archons and treat them as these evil forces that are controlling our lives that we have to break free from and all this, right? But one of the important things to understand is that let's look at the other decan that's involved in this square. We've got Saturn, which represents all this stuff about, past karma, these past patterns, these forces of control, these structures which keep us fixed so that we feel like we're rats in a cage running around looking for the cheese, and we don't have any control over how the maze is built. We just run around frantically, give me the cheese, give me the cheese. But the Saturn is in the first decan of Pisces, which in this whole system, in the Thoth tarot, has the name Indolence. And in the Rider-Waite-Smith tarot, it has the image of a man who's got 8 cups stacked in a kind of unusual way, and he's just walking away from them. Like you get the point of view that this guy's just fed up with the situation. He's had enough, and it's just time to check out and do something else, man. This 8 cup situation isn't going anywhere. And so I think Saturn in Pisces, although it's kind of a contradiction in a way, because Saturn is all about the structures, the commitments we've made, the responsibilities we've made, the duties and obligations we need to fulfill, and all this. But it's in a place the decan of this is actually has more to do with this thing about wanting to get away, wanting to escape, wanting to go walkabout, wanting to go on a journey or an adventure, or it could be seen as a kind of, like Pisces is very dreamy. It could have to do with an escapist fantasy kind of thing, but I think it also ties into what I'm saying about the forces of the unconscious, right? And that's when the heroic ego is feeling frustrated with the big knot, the big tangle, the big mess, or whatever, then it wants to get away from it, that we have to admit to ourselves that the way that it's got us hooked, the way that these things have us hooked in, may be at some level unconscious, and that it may be the conscious mind may want to think it's in control, may want to think it has authority, autonomy, sovereignty, the sovereign king ego, but the whole structure of even being a king is a part of this tree. You know what I'm saying? The whole the myth of the hero is part of the tree. The myth of and I think it's kind of funny, this whole issue of whether the tree is good or bad, and that the idea of whether or not a pattern is good or bad. I mean, that if you think about like dancing, right? Like you want to go and have fun and you want to dance, you know, it helps to have a drum beat. You know, it helps to have a rhythm. It helps to have, you know, where the kick drum is landing and the bass hits in a way that everybody starts, you know, bouncing along to the same beat. And, you know, there's this whole, you know, those who dance to the sound of their own drummer were thought to be insane, but they couldn't hear the music at all. But the point is, though, is that, you know, I think that there is something about the patterns, the forms, the structures, which we don't have to treat them as if they are like some demonic force that's trying to control our lives and make us miserable, but instead we can recognize them as something that has been, you know, it may not even be like, what the question is, was this something that is like some angelic being that knows more than us, or is this just a product of what our ancestors, the people who walked the path before us, built these structures to point signs in different directions? This is kind of what Jordan Peterson gets into, his old maps of meaning and why we ought to take them seriously and stuff. You know, I think you can look at both sides of the situation at once. You can say that maybe these are just constructions, these are just things that people built, but then at the same time, maybe we can appreciate what is a construction. Maybe, you know, we have this urge to break free out of a story, out of a pattern, but we can also appreciate, wasn't it wonderful that life is like a story? Isn't it wonderful that life is like a dream? Isn't it wonderful that there's a kind of art to it? There's a kind of an art of storytelling, an art of narrative, a beautiful unfolding of a pattern that either it opens up or it has different moments of contraction and opening, and like a little kid playing peekaboo, like now you see me, now you don't, and it has all these it's like you can be, I think we can, you know, a lot of when people talk about awakening, like a spiritual awakening, is sort of like not being so hooked into the drama that you can, but do you ever get free from this? Do you okay, now I get to just make my own rules. I get to write my own story. I don't have to put up with these forms and structures ordering me around, telling me what to do, and I want to live. And I think what I get as an astrologer is that I think that a lot of people have a resistance to astrology because they want to have autonomy. They want to have freedom. They want to live their own lives. They don't want to feel subject to something that's out of their control, putting some kind of limitation on them. But I think it's kind of like, that's kind of like the capitalism of the ego in a way, right? Because the ego wants to be able to have, you know, it's like we live in a society where if it's, I don't know, again, the society, right? But the comfort or the idea that if you're completely overweight, now you can just take a pill. You don't even have to exercise, you don't have to work for it, you can just take a pill, or you get liposuction. If you're old, if your skin is, you know, you can make, if you're an 80-year-old person who's on the verge of death, if you have enough money, then you can just pay to make yourself look like a 20-year-old. you know, or like there's all this kind of thing where whatever is actually real and natural doesn't really matter anymore, because if your ego is in control, you can just do whatever you want. You can say, if you want to, you can. And I think there's some kind of tension around this between maybe like the transgender issues and that of like, if your ego wants to be a different gender, you can just do it, right? It doesn't even matter what happens. But I don't want to take sides on that one necessarily, right? I don't. It's not my job to go around, or you know. And there's this whole belief of what is natural, to be in tune with the in the tree. Because there's a whole question of this sort of tree of life. Is the tree of life a natural thing that we need to respect or is it something that we ourselves are part of we are the creators of this tree, and that the tree is only here in the present moment if people like me and you talk about it, appreciate it, bring it into existence by doing our own rituals, our own ceremonies, our own practices. And the tree is not actually separate from us and what we are doing with our lives and the decisions that we make and the choices that we navigate and all this, right? In all this, there's one other thing that I need to mention, right? And that a lot of the attention in this system gets put on the hard aspects, like the square between Sun and Saturn. I was watching an astrology video at some point in time where they're saying, when is a soft aspect or a minor aspect not a minor aspect? And that's when it is on a very tight orb, right? And so another thing to consider is that Mars has just ingressed into Leo, and that it is in the first decan of Leo in the early degrees. And so this whole aspect between the Sun and Saturn, and the Sun is in a tight spot because it's really feeling the weight of these structures, these patterns, these commitments, these obligations, and the situations, the karmic consequences of our actions are all weighing down upon us. But what's interesting is that Mars is in Leo, and Leo is the sign of the Sun, right? So Leo is ruled by the Sun. So Mars is there to do its work, and who is the boss but the Sun? And then the Mars is a nice sextile to the Sun, right? And so the Sun is, oh my goodness, I have to deal with this heavy Saturn obligation weighing down on me. What on earth am I to do? And meanwhile, the Saturn's in the 8th decan. Saturn's in the 8 of Cups decan, right? The Indolence. Saturn's like, I just want to get out of here, man. Saturn doesn't even want to be there either, right? So Saturn's in the same, basically Saturn's just in the same fucking situation. And then, so Mars but at least Mars stands for cutting, right? And what I was going to say about the Susan Chang thing about the 8 of Swords is that she was saying that it's like with that image of the fate as the weaver, and stitching and sewing and all this kind of stuff, is that sometimes when you're using a sewing machine, you may get a huge tangle going on, or you might get a huge jam where the thread gets all bungled up in the machine. And I think that's kind of what the situation feels like, is that we want to move forward and we want to do stuff, but it's like the thread of fate is just knotted and tangled and twisted in all these ways. But the good news, well, it's kind of funny, is that the good news is that Mars is there to cut. Mars is they call it as a masculine thing, the independent masculine force or whatever. But it's this thing that, like, we talk about these two different forces. That one force is about the yang force. It tends to want to individuate, be separate, be independent. And then the yin force wants to connect, wants to receive, wants to hold on to like a family, wants to, like the mother goose or like the hen who wants to keep her eggs warm is kind of like the yin, the feminine. And it doesn't have to be, I'm not one of these guys who's that hung up on the divine masculine, divine feminine stuff, but I'm not scared to talk about it either, right? But that's where it comes from. And so Mars in Leo is a very yangy Mars who doesn't have much patience for this being attached to old patterns of the past and all this kind of stuff. And it can lend a sextile aspect. It's lending this harmonious sextile aspect with its own domicile ruler, the sun, in Gemini. And then the Gemini's ruler is Mercury, and that's heading towards Uranus right now. So there's all these things coming together that is encouraging, is very encouraging of some kind of breakthrough, of some kind of breaking free from these past patterns. But it's also important to consider that Mars in Leo and Saturn in Pisces don't connect at all. In traditional, I mean, you could get into all these in conjunct or whatever they are, you modern astrologers and your fancy aspects. I'm more of a traditional guy, and in this situation, when we look at Leo and we look at, if you were to have Leo rising, you would have Aquarius on the 7th and you would have Pisces on the 8th. And that the 8th house is said to be like a bad house. I don't take it that seriously, but it's said to be a bad house because it is in aversion, or it's not seen by Leo, from the position of Leo. So there's a bit of an issue that Mars is in a place to help with the sun, with its heroic, kingly, whatever efforts, of being independent and being autonomous, but the actual problem that the sun is dealing with is this Saturn in Pisces weighing down on it, and the Mars unfortunately doesn't see that at all. Mars doesn't have, like, I don't know, man. Mars can't actually do anything about this Saturn in Pisces problem. So we're a bit, but the thing is another thing to consider is that, like I was saying, that we've got this Mercury-Uranus thing going on in Taurus. Jupiter rules Saturn. Jupiter is also there in Taurus. And Jupiter will eventually make a conjunction with Uranus in Taurus. And I have to say, I think Jupiter-Uranus conjunctions are actually very positive in terms of being liberating, in terms of giving you room to grow, room to expand, room to broaden your horizons, room to be the person you are, right? And not feeling so claustrophobic by all these old structures and conditions and obligations and restrictions or whatever, right? So I think that there's something really optimistic, but when it comes to the Jupiter-Saturn stuff, and when Jupiter gets with Uranus, it's going to take some time, It's not going to just happen right now. We're going to have to be patient for Jupiter to make its way to Uranus. But in more of the short term, we have Mercury conjunct Uranus, and Mercury is a messenger, Mercury is a communicator, Mercury makes deals as a negotiator. So there could be something cool happening with Mercury and Uranus, at least. So yeah, there's a lot going on, right? And this is all in the middle of the Jupiter-Mars-Pluto T-Square, which is in effect, and just to drop another layer on you, as if that wasn't enough to deal with, hey? Here's another layer of astrology that probably has been going under the radar for most people, because it's not, as if I watch that many astrology videos. I'm whatever. So this has been about half an hour. Hopefully you like this one. Please like and subscribe to support my channel. And thank you to all the people who are following me. With my modest astrology channel that has I've got 115 subscribers as of right now, which is I've got friends who've got thousands and thousands and thousands but they've been in the game for longer, right? So I'm slowly building my way up from the bottom here, and I have a passion, I have a love for astrology, and I like to keep going with it. And so any support you can offer is greatly appreciated. Thank you very much. Okay.